To become homo amor is to become intimate with the entire fabric of the intimate universe. And to become intimate, right? To become intimate with reality is to actually break the myopic view of this local time and to step into what Bergson called the duration of time. Time is a duration. Time is a vast expanse experience, which is not measurable, which is not merely clock time. When I enter into time, at every moment in time, everything related to that quality of that moment in time is present. So when I encounter you and we find ourselves familiar and we all of a sudden begin to move towards each other and we begin to create together, or we feel friction or we feel creative calling, it's because we've done this before. Welcome, everyone. We're looking at reincarnation from the perspective of becoming homo amor in response to the meta crisis. Does that make sense, everyone? As we're looking at reincarnation from the perspective of becoming the new human in response to the meta crisis. I think I mentioned last week, I was happy to see my younger colleague, Nick Hendlin, who published an article that emerged out of cosmoerotic humanism, the sense of becoming the new human in response to the meta crisis, which has been really the core of what we've been talking about here at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion since 2010-11. When I first started the center with my dear friend Ken Wilber in 2009, we began this conversation. And really in 2011, after 2 years of intensive engagement, I myself came to this just very heartbreaking realization that just like we had faced at the dawn of humanity, this realization of death, the potential death of the human being, which we might call the first shock of existence, we were now facing the second shock. And the second shock was not the death of the human being, but the potential death of humanity. And that the potential death of humanity had two dimensions to it. One is the actual potential physical extinction, existential risk to our very existence in a physical existence kind of sense. And the second dimension of existential risk is risk to our existence in the existential sense, to our very humanness, the death of not humanity, but the death of our humanity. And that risk, both of them are deeply entwined. The second risk, the death of our humanity, is deeply related to reality becoming immersed inside of a planetary stack of digital structures in which all human beings will become embedded, and there will be constant nudges and prompts and directional signals fed into us from the digital environment, which will be personalized, micro-targeted, in order to, without our even realizing it's happening, form our opinion, shape our direction, literally, as Alex Pentland, the head of the MIT Media Lab, said proudly, shape our desire. That will live inside of an immersive digital environment, what we might well call a Skinner's box, a box of the kind designed by B.F. Skinner, who was the social behaviorist engineer who reigned at Harvard for 6 decades, who built a Skinner's box, what he called an operant conditioning chamber, in order to train rats and pigeons to invisibly control them through invisible schedules of variable reinforcement. In other words, by putting rewards there at undetermined times so that the pigeons and rats would always be acting in order to ultimately get those rewards. So Skinner envisioned the capacity to control humanity human beings becoming the rats and the pigeons in a global Skinner's box. Not because Skinner was evil, right, in his intention. Skinner was a materialist. He thought the world was only made of things, was only material, that the things had no ultimate purpose, that there was no ultimate value, but he naturally loved humanity. He thought humanity would destroy itself. So he was one of the earlier portenders of existential risk. And so he said the only way we can save humanity is to control this exploded population of human beings through turning the world into a Skinner's box. Wow. That's the death of our humanity. And then the artificial intelligence explosion, which is not the first wave of AI. The first wave of AI is Alex Pentland at the MIT Media Lab kind of using social media to create the first version of a Skinner's box. That's the first wave of artificial intelligence. The second wave of artificial intelligence is the emergence of personalized artificial intelligence, chatbots hijacking the conversational cosmos. Just like the first wave of AI hijacked attention, which is the first quality of our humanity, the second wave of AI, ChatGPT-4, Claude, Grok, right, Perplexity, right, all of the various chatbots that are now being personalized. So you have an experience, it's just beginning to happen, that you're having a personal conversation, when in fact you're having nothing of the kind. An oracular, personalized conversation, which conversation now, which is the second quality of our humanity, intimate communion through conversation, is now hijacked. And as we've said before, we head towards a world in which all children are socialized by artificial intelligence, personalized artificial intelligence that knows the child better than anyone, having constant conversation, an AI tutoring system, which knows the children better than anything, which then displaces education. And my beautiful friend and colleague, Zach Stein, and I have called that the personhood conferral problem, which actually challenges our very humanity. The response to that, the response to the potential death of the humanity or the death of our humanity, has to be a rebirth of humanity or an evolution of humanity. Or we need to reclaim, or perhaps in some ways claim for the first time, the deepest possible understanding of what it means to be human. That emergence of the new human in response to existential risk, the new existence in response to the risk to existence, existential risk, the new existential sense of what it means to be a human being, is what we call the fulfillment of Homo sapien as Homo Amor. That makes sense? Everyone got this? Everyone, that's where we are. That's our intention. We're inside. So that was our intention setting. Now, what we're doing, and this is the third week that we're doing this in, right? The third week that we're doing this in is we're going to now add in dimensions that we've never talked about before. You know, when Barbara and I started, Barbara Marks Hubbard, we started together we all together came together to form this community. And with Lisa, who did a beautiful job the first couple of years in implementing and executing and creating and recapitulating, right? So as Barbara and I began this vision, we've tried to lay out over, and what week are we in, everybody? Somebody tell me what week we're in. We're in week 453, slay me, right? So for like the first 450 weeks, we've been laying down this vision of the new human and the new humanity. So we've been on this very, very deep journey. So if you're just joining us now, right, you got a little bit to catch up on that, but that's good. We're actually going to be publishing this summer about, Krista, tell me, about how many? About, I don't know, about 40 to 50 books online, which many of them are, maybe 25, 30 of them are the first episodes, right? The first several hundred episodes. Is that intense, insane? So this is the oral essays of the first, right? The oral essays, oh my God, the oral essays of cosmorotic humanism as they appeared, right, in One Mountain and in mystery schools. Is that like insane? Is that like gorgeous, everybody? Is that like crazy gorgeous? So we're creating this great library together of both new writing And we're gathering together, right, an enormous amount of writing that's been done, that's been edited by many of them beautifully by Lena, right? Others by other editors, post Lena, some before, right? We're editing, putting together, putting in volumes, putting together this great library, right? As this download into the source of code of culture at this moment of metacrisis in what I call a time between stories. Zach calls a time between worlds. We put those phrases together, right? A time between worlds and a time between stories. And that phrase has, by the way, exploded and caught on. I've seen it like in 50 places, a time between stories, a time between worlds. That's what we've been talking about here for the last, God knows how long, right? Really since 2010, 11, but intensely in One Mountain for the last 453 weeks. We've never missed a week. Is that true? We've never missed a week. So it's, wow. I just want to get the beauty of this. I want to get the depth of this, right? So are we ready? Are we ready to step in? Are we ready to play a larger game? Are we ready to respond to, for the first time in history, a threat to the existence of humanity and a threat to to what it means to be a human being? The very nature of our humanity, right, is now challenged in an essential way. And so what we need to do is we need to step in and we need to gather the deepest validated insights across all vectors of wisdom from every time, right, from every period of history, from the traditional period, right, the pre-modern period, right, from the modern period, from the postmodern period. We need to weave that together into a new tapestry, right, a new set of holes into, and these, all of these different parts, these different ideas themselves, right, have their ideas are alive, right, Lena? We're talking about that. Ideas are alive, right? Like, our love is alive, right? Our love is alive, right? Ideas are alive. Ideas express reality. Right? So the ideas come together and they form a new whole, a new intimacy. And that new intimacy is this new story of value. So now in that context, what we're doing is, we ready? Oh my God, ready? So in that context, what are we doing? We're now in the last, that gives you context these last 3 weeks, we're now adding a dimension that we haven't focused on, which is to become homo amor, to become the new human, to become the new humanity. I need to talk about who am I, where am I, and what ought I do? Those are the three great questions of cosmorotic humanism. Now, part of who am I, and where am I, and what ought I do, who, where, and what, needs to now expand and extend beyond one lifetime. Because what we tend to do is myopically locate ourselves in one lifetime and we ignore anything beyond. Now, there's a way to get lost, in a kind of occult, to get lost in a kind of, superficial, new age kind of obsession, right, with other lives and other galaxies. And that's got to be careful. Our primary focus is the fullness of this moment and the moral, ethical, erotic imperative of this moment. The imperative of Eros value that demands our response and demands our joy and demands our engagement and demands that we, as homo amor, as the new human, right, as God's hands, as God's dangling modifiers, as God's sentences, as God's verbs, participate together in the evolution of love. We literally become the new human. We become the new humanity. Nonetheless, at the same time, even though our full focus is right here, it's into the future of humanity. We're receiving the best validated wisdom from the past, integrating it into the depth of this present moment, and hearing the call of the future and standing for the future. And we're standing for the trillions of unborn lives. At the same time, we need to widen our perspective. We need to drop more deeply into what William James called our wider self. And that's our conversation around reincarnation. That's what we're talking about. Does that make sense, everyone? So reincarnation is the realization, that's what we've talked about the last 2 weeks, that it's not over when it's over, that there's a thread of essence. There's a plot line, and this is a big deal, that moves from lifetime to lifetime. That's the core of reincarnation. There's a plot line that moves from lifetime to lifetime, and we need to understand, right, and feel into that plot line, okay? So that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what we're going to be talking about. So I want to today, in the next 30 minutes, right? I want to feel into the sense of a plot line. And we began, right, last week, right? And what last week was week 2. So in part 2, we looked at a couple of cases from Ian Stevenson. This is from his 1960 article, which is the beginning of his career, right? Where he is already at University of Virginia, right? And he begins documenting stories, right, of children, right, who remember, right, their last lifetime with great clarity. That's what he's doing. And that is an insanely important piece of evidence, right? And he collected many, many thousands of cases. There were 2,000 to 3,000 that he documented clearly, in which we actually see that when the body dies, there's something essential, right, which is deeper than the body, which is the unique will, the unique quality of intimacy, the unique storyline, the unique set of challenges and invitations, the unique transformations that need to happen, the unique weaknesses, the unique pathologies, the unique wounds, that all of those are actually transmitted into the next lifetime. They're like, that's a very major realization that lived in many of the great traditions, although not all of them, but in many of the great masters. It's very strong in the Solomon lineage. It's central to the life vision, let's say, of Isaac Luria, who is the major figure of Renaissance Kabbalah that then defines the Renaissance. Right. So it's this very, very deep realization of this continuity of unique self, this continuity of unique will, this continuity of unique wounding, right? That actually takes place. So much so that it applies even to physical wounding, right? That when stories of a child who dies, right, through a wound, right, a fatal wound, let's say right above the right side of the chest. So the new child that's born is born with a huge birthmark, right, in precisely that place. And that new child that's born remembers the name and an enormous amount of detail that they couldn't possibly know, right, about that child who's died, right, who dies 9, 10, 11 months before the new child's born. So the new child's born and remembers and identifies themselves with this previous child. Now, this had happened, as I mentioned last week, this has happened before in history, but they were anecdotal. You couldn't verify them. And what Stevenson set about doing, and my dear friend Michael Murphy was one of his major funders. Michael is the owner, president of Esalen, right? So Michael funded a lot of Stevenson's research and a lot of that of his successors at University of Virginia. But the article we're reading from is from 1960. And again, what are we interested in here? We're actually adding a realization of the continuity of consciousness, right, to the experience of Homo Amor. Okay, does that make sense, everyone? And I think I've noted before where Jung basically says, the great, psychoanalyst, psychologist of the 20th century, Jung basically says that in all of his patients over 35, right, the root issue of their neurosis, of their depression, of their anxiety, of their mental breakdown, of their impotence is always an incapacity, right, to understand how their lives could possibly have a meaning in the face of impending death. And Jung says actually that without a sense of my own immortality of the soul, or what we would call continuity of consciousness, I actually cannot solve any mental breakdown. That's shocking. Can't be solved. Can't be done. That's correct. That's correct. In other words, one of the things we've talked about a lot together is that we try and do psychology by reorganizing the memories of our early childhood. Does everyone get that? So we go back to our early childhood and we reorganize those memories, and that's actually quite important. And we'll be talking about that in coming weeks, probably particularly next week in our Unique Self 2.0 course, the third and final week, we'll be talking about that. But that's insufficient. I can't actually recover myself and live a life of joy, of fullness, of fulfilling the actual purpose of my existence, right? Unless I actually am able to access and deepen into and be moved by not just a reorganized or relived set of old traumatic memories, that I'm able to go back into the trauma and heal some of the trauma by, let's say, accessing my inner child and having a conversation with my inner child, or finding my inner child at a moment where my inner child was abandoned and being the powerful adult and picking up my inner child and embracing my inner child. That's enormously important, but it's insufficient. It can't get you home, right? You can't heal just through the past, nor can you heal by being in the depth of the present, right? Meaning I'm going to do the profound meditation, which takes me into the bliss of eternity. And therefore the work of trauma work, for example, is no longer necessary. That's also a huge mistake, right? And the first is the dogma, right, of classical modern psychology, right? It's a false dogma. It's true, but partial, right? Meaning therefore false, right? Because it claims absolute, it claims you can heal everything by doing attachment work. Can't be done. That's critical, but insufficient. But I also can't heal everything by being in the depth of the present and the eternity of it all, in which all memories fall away. That's also necessary to have this wider sense of my true self, which is my field, not just of awareness, but of awareness and allurement. That's critical. Who I am, my consciousness is not just, and I was talking to my dear friend yesterday on WhatsApp. We were talking about what the word consciousness means. It doesn't just mean awareness. It means awareness and allurement. Consciousness includes desire for value. That's critical. So that's the present. In the present, I'm in the fullness of my consciousness. But my consciousness actually also is the fullness of the present. It also reaches to the future. And that breaks out in my unique self, because uniqueness, as we said last week, is the organ of perception of the future. So I've got to access my memories of the future. Does that make sense? Okay. So my memories of the future are not only the future calling of my unique self for me to give my unique gift and my unique circle of intimacy and influence. It's not just about me living my unique life in the future. It's not just about me giving my unique gift. It's not even just about me writing my unique poem and singing my unique song. It actually goes beyond the boundary of this lifetime, right? There's a larger trajectory to my soul, a larger trajectory to the vector of my irreducible uniqueness. My irreducible uniqueness is on a magical mystery tour from the past through the present and into the future. So I'm called by the future, right? So it's not actually true, right, that, you know what, if I die in time, existential risk is not going to affect me. No, I'm going to reincarnate right into the next vortex. I'm called by the future. And so I actually begin to need to feel myself, to experience myself in a very direct way, not in an abstract way. I need to have a direct experience of myself across generations. Does that make sense? I'm covenanted with all the past and all the present and all the future. What we called it last week, a covenant between generations. And so the realization of reincarnation, that I reincarnate, is that I'm covenanted into the future. I'm called by my future, right? And that in this moment, in this lifetime, as homo amor, I'm both madly in love with life. I'm madly in love with divinity as she appears in me, and divinity as she appears in she and in thee and in we. And I'm madly committed to gift into my unique circle of intimacy and influence. And I'm called by the mad, wild, alive, wondrous call of the future that calls me to my emergence. So I'm not just in the present, I'm writing the script of the play of my future, both within this lifetime and in the next lifetime. Okay. So that's our context. That's a big context. And I know that I'm spending quite a bit of time on context, but context matters. Otherwise, we're just chatting. Okay, the context matters. We're actually filling in and expanding what it means to be homo amor. So I'm going to read you a couple of more cases from Stevenson, and then I'm going to go to a couple of the Solomon lineage masters so we can begin to hear how they talk about reincarnation. Okay, that's week 3. And then we're going to go deeper next week. Okay, we good? Context matters. Context is everything. So this is the case of Shanti Devi. This is from Stevenson's article. This is Shanti Devi. Shanti Devi is born in 1926, and she begins at the age of 3 to recall and state details of her former life in the town of Mutra, which is about 80 miles away from where she is born. And she says that her former name had been Lugdi, that she was originally born in 1902, and she was a Choban by caste. That was her caste in terms of Indian caste. She'd married a cloth merchant named Kedar Nath Chaubey. And then she says that in her former life as Lugdi, right, she'd given birth to a son. She gave birth to a son and she died 10 days later. That's Shanti Devi, 1926. Okay, stay with me. So Shanti Devi starts making these statements from about age 3 till about age 9. Okay? And finally, her family essentially can't take it anymore. So they write, right, to the town, right, that she's describing, right, town that she's describing of Mutra, this town 80 miles away. They send messages, right, and they say, wow, right, did such a story ever really exist? And in the rural countryside of India, of course, 80 miles away is a world away. And indeed, right, they find that this exact person, Kedar, right, exists, right? This person, Kedar, this cloth merchant, answers the letter and he confirms, right, everything, right, that she says, right, in her statements. Okay. Then he sends a relative to the girl's home, right? Now, he sends a relative to Shanti Devi's home that Shanti Devi, right, knew in her claimed past life as Lugdi. But he sends the relative kind of unannounced, right? There's no plan. She doesn't know that anyone's coming. So this person comes who is a figure, 2 people come that are sent by Kedar, who are figures in her last life. And she immediately identifies both of these people that she's never seen before. Everyone with me? Right? So then they established that the girl had never left Delhi. That's where she was living now in this lifetime as Shanti Devi. She never left Delhi. And then literally India gets in an uproar over this, and they appoint a committee to do this kind of deep investigation, right? So the committee's appointed, and they actually arrange a trip of Shanti Devi to Mutra, right, to the town in which she thought that she lived in the previous life when she was named Lugdi, married to this merchant, Kedar Nath Chaubey, right, and gives birth to a son to him and dies 10 days later. That's her memory. So she gets to Mutra, and at the Mutra, then she immediately recognizes another relative of Kedar, who's in a huge crowd. She's then put in a carriage, and then the driver of the carriage is instructed to follow her directions. So she gives him precise directions, right, to the district and to the house of Kedar, right? Not Chaubey, she remembers her husband in this previous lifetime. She recognizes the house, even though it's been repainted in a different color, right? Then around the house, this old Brahmin appears, and she identifies this old Indian man, this Brahmin, as Kedar Nath Chaubey's father. She says, oh, that's my husband in the last lifetime's father, meaning she's remembering her father-in-law, okay? Then when she enters the house that she ostensibly lived in the previous lifetime, she enters the house, she answers correctly a whole series of questions that are put to her regarding the arrangement of the rooms, the closets. She has detailed memories of the arrangement of rooms and closets. Then she goes to the house of the people that she says she remembers to have been her own parents in a previous lifetime. She's able to pick those parents also out of a crowd of more than 50 people and to call them, each of them by name. Wow. Then Shanti Devi says that she had hidden some money in another house, which was the house of one of her ostensible former husband, Kedar Nath Chaubey, right, that she had hid money in one of his relatives' houses. So they get to that relative's house. She points to a corner of one of the rooms where she says she had buried the money. So they dig a hole. Witnesses come, but it's empty. There's no money there. So Shanti Devi says, no. I am 1,000 billion% sure that I remember in this previous lifetime that I had left money there. And then listen to this. And then eventually Kedarnath Chowdhury, meaning her former husband, as it were, in her memory in the previous lifetime, says that he had found the money and removed it after his wife's death. Like, wow. Okay. And Shanti Devi used in her own speech, she used the same idioms of speech that were familiar in Mutra before she'd been there. And she's raised in Delhi with, in essence, a Mutra dialect. And it turns out there are about 24 statements of her memories, which verified precise facts that were impossible for her to have known. And there's not even one instant, not even one, of an incorrect statement made by her. Okay? It's like, wow. And it's really a big deal to get this. And these cases take place all around the world. They're not just Indian cases. Does everyone get that? They're not just Indian cases. Right? They're not just Indian cases. That's a very big deal. They're not just Indian cases. They take place, everywhere, in different ways, right around the world. So I'm going to read you just one more. So a 6-year-old Belgian boy. Let's go to Belgium now. So a 6-year-old Belgian boy insists that a portrait of his uncle Albert, who's been killed in the First World War in 1915, he insists that portrait of Uncle Albert is a portrait of him. Okay, it's part of him. So, of course, his parents think he's crazy. Why does he think a portrait of Uncle Albert's a portrait of him? But he does. Now, the boy is especially devoted to his paternal grandmother, and the rest of the grandchildren ignore her. And she's, of course, Albert's mother. And he's happy. And when he's with her, he's happy, he's healthy. And when he's with his own parents, he's sullen, disobedient, anxiety. So Albert, the boy's uncle, had been the favorite of that grandmother. Okay? Let me actually make sure I get it right. So one second, I guess he's 6 years old. His Uncle Albert is killed. Okay, I got it. Okay. So his Uncle Albert is the paternal grandmother, right? Meaning that it's his brother's brother. And when he's with his paternal grandmother, right, then he's happy. When he's not happy kind of any place else. And it turns out that this paternal grandmother is madly in love with Albert, with that particular son. In other words, the favorite of the grandmother was actually Albert and not his father, not Robert's father. Does everyone get that? Like, It's like, everyone get that? So he's completely close with the paternal grandmother. It means the grandmother who's the mother of both his Uncle Albert and his dad. And this mother loves Uncle Albert and ignored Robert's dad. Okay? Now, when Robert is 3, he sees a swimming pool. He runs along the diving board and he dives in. Okay? Now, his Uncle Albert, right, had been like this great diver. Okay? So this kid, little Robert at 3, sees a swimming pool, runs to the swimming pool, goes to the diving board and dives in, like insanely. But his Uncle Albert had been this major diver. Then a visitor points a kind of one of those early movie cameras at Robert and turns the handle with a clicking noise, right? And then, right, Robert cries out and says, don't, they killed me that way the last time. Don't, they killed me that way the last time. So when he hears the clicking sound, he remembers his death, and Albert had been killed by machine gun fire, right? The clicking of machine gun fire while trying to destroy a German emplacement in World War II. His grandmother reports that Robert used to call her with nicknames that no one knew except for Albert, right? And that Robert knew her likes and dislikes that she had only shared with Albert. Huh. So imagine, my friends, just imagine for a second that we have about just approximately 3,000 cases that have more or less, right, this kind of level of depth and detail. Does that make sense? Does everyone get why that's significant? Meaning, if you're a rational human being today, right, we have a new reservoir of information that has opened up in this time of metacrisis. That's not an accident. The nature of the intimate universe, right? As the universe careens towards the potential death of our humanity or the death of humanity itself, right? A new well of information opens up, which is the capacity to gather new forms of information and to validate those forms of information, and particularly to move from anecdotal stories, anecdotes, right, to actually be able to document the actual and utter reality, right, of life beyond death, right, and of a continuity, a thread. That's what's important, not just life beyond death, but a continuity of the personal thread, of the personal plot line, right, of an individual life. That's unimaginably significant. Okay. So now I'm going to read you now a different kind of story. A different kind of story. And I'm going to read this with intention from the mystical literature. And I'm going to read it not in my language, but in the way that it's recorded in what I would call the naive texts of the mystical literature. Does that make sense? The way it's recorded in the naive texts of the mystical literature. Okay? So I'm gonna read it. So if you can, this is a good moment. Just close your eyes and let's go for a ride. Okay. So this is a story that comes from the court of the Baal Shem Tov, and I'm watching the time. We're going to finish at about 2:03 in about 6 or 7 minutes. Okay. This is a story that comes from the court of the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov is a major mystical master, right, who founds the Hasidic movement in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. And he's one of the great lineage holders in the Solomon lineage that goes back to Solomon. And those of you who are with us who know that we're telling this new story of value called cosmotic humanism, which is not simply an extension of the Solomon lineage, although the Solomon lineage is an important ground, but it's actually a weaving together of the best validated insights we have from all the different lineages of wisdom and what we're calling the interior sciences, the sciences of the inside across history, into a new whole greater than the sum of the parts, a new story of value, a new story of intrinsic and evolving value, right? That's what we're calling cosmotic humanism, which is a story, right, of, in one of its key chapters, the emergence of the new human and the new humanity, which in the nature of the intimate universe that arises in precisely the right moment in time in order to be able to respond to the metacrisis. And it's our assertion that in this time between worlds and time between stories, only a new story of value has the capacity to respond to the metacrisis. Only a new story of value has the capacity to take us home, to be able to either avoid the collapse, the system's collapses of existential risk, right? Or to rebuild on the day after. That's what we're about here. Okay. So now I want to invoke one more story, right, from the lineage. And then we're going to go to those of us who are with us to Unique Self 2.0. So I want to read you this text. It's a little bit of a shocking text from the Baal Shem Tov. right? And the text reads as follows. So people seeking an audience, right, with the great master usually came asking for guidance, right, in their service, in their devotion, right, in their great practice of spirit. But this particular visitor who came to the Baal Shem Tov lost no time, came to the master and saying, hey, I have no special needs. I have no particular problems. I have nothing that needs any attention. The truth is, the only real reason I'm here is because a lucrative business deal brought me to a nearby town. And since it was so close, right, the man says to the master, since it was so close, and I've heard so many kind of wild stories about you, right, I thought, hey, I was curious. I thought I'd come see you and hear what everybody was talking about. The Baal Shem Tov, the master says to this businessman, he says, if you feel there's nothing I can help you with, then perhaps you could stay a while and I could tell you a story. So the man's come to visit him, so he says, okay. And so the Baal Shem Tov begins to tell this businessman with no requests and with no issues to be dealt with, begins to tell him a story. He says, once there were two childhood friends who were inseparable as they grew up together. However, when they became adults, their ways parted. One became wealthy, and the other was very poor. So in order to save his family from hunger, the poor man sought out his childhood friend and asked him for help. Asked him for help. The wealthy man said, of course I'll help you. When we were children, we promised each other we would remain friends forever and we would share in everything we have. Right? And you're now in trouble. I'm going to give you now half of my wealth. And so the person was for whom the wheel of fortune, right, had spun round and gone up, gives his friend for whom the wheel of fortune had gone down half of his wealth. And as often happens, the wheel turned again. The wheels of fortune reversed. And the one who had been wealthy was now very poor. And the friend to whom earlier he'd given half of his fortune had now become very wealthy. But what happens? He goes to his friend who he had helped just a few years ago, and his friend, who's now wealthy, refuses to part with any of his fortune and turns him away. So that's the second turning of the wheel. And then there's a third turning of the wheel. The poor man became rich again, and the rich man again became poor. Okay? So they each returned to their original situation. And again, the one who had now become poor, who had refused his friend, nonetheless goes to his friend and says, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. Right? I'm so sorry I didn't give you anything when you were down, but now I'm down. Would you help me? And so his friend agrees. He's like, wow, yes, I'll help you. I'll help you. Right? For sure. I'll give you half. Right? You're forgiven. And then again, there's the passing of time and there's a fourth turning of the wheel. But again, when the good man who's now poor goes to his friend who's now wealthy, his friend again refuses to honor the note that they had signed. And he finds himself homeless and penniless. Years pass. Years pass. The two men die. They come before the heavenly court to account for their lives. And of course, the mean-spirited violation of all the oaths and all the promises of the man who refused to help his friend when he was down in those reversals of fortune, right, obviously witnessed against him. And so his friend was sent into the bliss of eternal paradise, right? And he, right, is sent to a much more painful process of understanding. Stop. Stop. The friend who's been promised eternity says, stop. Stop. I can't bear to see my friend, even though he's betrayed me twice. I still can't bear to see him suffer on my account. I won't allow it. And the heavenly court was in an uproar. The Baal Shem Tov continues his story. This was unusual. What were they going to do? So they decided that the only way to solve the story was to have both men return to Earth, and that the man who was locked in his ego, who had violated and betrayed, would have one last chance to become at one to atone. And so they both returned to Earth, and the egoic man reincarnates as a wealthy merchant, and the good man who wanted to help his friend in the heavenly tribunal, in the heavenly court, he agrees to reincarnate as a common street beggar. And it came to pass one day that this righteous beggar, this good man, knocks on the door of the rich man begging for food. And he hadn't eaten for a very long time. And he was literally on the verge of starvation, but he was rudely and callously sent away, and the beggar died. And at this point in the Baal Shem Tov story, the rich man has tears streaming down his face, and he can barely speak. And he says, oh my God, yesterday, I turned a beggar away from my door. And later I heard that beggar was found dead in the street. Was he the beggar in your story? And of course, no answer was necessary, for it was clear. It was clear. And the Baal Shem Tov says to this wealthy merchant that his former friend, the beggar, had a widow and children, and that if he would go to them and give 3/4 of his fortune to that family, he could perhaps become whole once again. Do you understand, my friends? Neither of them remembered the previous incarnation. But when we actually begin to realize that we haven't just gone around once, we've gone around before, we've been here before, we become intimate. Every encounter is an encounter with someone that we have probably met before. There are unpaid debts. There are unfulfilled possibilities. There are promises to be kept. There are loves to be kindled and rekindled. There are betrayals to be healed. There are births to be birthed that were never birthed before. Right? That's the story of our lives. To become homo amor is to become intimate with the entire fabric of the intimate universe. And to become intimate, right? To become intimate with reality is to actually break the myopic view of this local time and to step into what Bergson called the duration of time. Time is a duration. Time is a vast expanse experience, which is not measurable, which is not merely clock time. When I enter into time, at every moment in time, everything related to that quality of that moment in time is present. So when I encounter you and we find ourselves familiar and we all of a sudden begin to move towards each other and we begin to create together, or we feel friction or we feel creative calling, it's because we've done this before. And there's places to go together. And we were on a magical mystery tour together and it was not completed. And there's promises to be kept, and there's potentials to be births, and there's joys to be lived, and there's celebrations to be celebrated. And there's sometimes homo amor knows that love and intimacy leaks forwards and backwards in time. Homo amor steps underneath clock time, underneath chronos time, and enters into kairos time, in which all past and present and future is actually available in every intimate encounter. And even if I don't know it, nor should I know it in my analytic mind, the lure of feeling, the lure, the invitation, right, of that deepest, profound, unique allurement is what becomes the voice that I follow. That's the experience of the clarified heart's desire of homo amor. Wow. Okay. Deep bow. We're going to jump into the other link right now.